Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GANS processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
And thank you very much, everyone. It's a beautiful Sunday afternoon. Thank you all for being here. And we all understand how important this week is going to be. More than usual. Every week has been important as it leads up to everything that we're trying to achieve. And it becomes more in focus as to what it is that we're trying to achieve, isn't it? So as the knowledge seekers, let's see what's going on here. I see. Oh, okay. I guess I have all the right screens.
We're seeing, I think, your first one, Basic GANS Tech, Direction of Flow.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. I'm just with the updates now, I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, we'll get rid of this screen. Now I can see the screen. Well, one screen overlapping another screen, and this is actually very instructive because that's what we really want to do. So I want to welcome all the Cash American Knowledge Team leaders here. And let's remember that this is a worldwide organization. So we're just part of a whole hive of intense knowledge seeking. So this is the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science. We are discussing today basic GANS tech. The subject of the direction of flow has come up. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It's September the 21st, World Peace Day of 2025. This is the Kesh Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. And as we continue and have continued for so many years, we're trying to condense all the knowledge, and it's getting very difficult to condense the knowledge because the knowledge is overflowing. And isn't it appropriate? We're talking about the direction of flow. So where is it flowing and how do we determine that? So please enjoy the trip today because we're going to try and get a better understanding of the direction of flow, because this is kind of important. Because when we're talking about a direction of flow, the first thing we have to talk about is that there was a creation of matter. And in book number 1 from Marin Tavakoli Kesh, there was the universal order of creation of matter, the coming together of dark matter, combining antimatter and matter. And we're trying to define that in scientific means. But when we have one matter, we also have another matter. And then we have to understand that there's more than two matters. And the structure of a light is in book number 2, telling us how we go from one matter to another matter. And this is very important because it's fundamental to the universal order of creation of matter. So if we could go from one to another, what happens when we want to grow? What happens when we want to have more? What are the rules at play? So in book number 3, The Origin of the Universe shows how one matter can split up into two matters. So we have our universe, which we're intimately familiar with it. I'm sure you've all traveled through all of our universe. And we have a sister universe that we've also traveled all the way through, but we're not really sure if we have traveled because we're not sure if we were awake to that possibility. So what is the situation according to the 396 One Planet, One Nation, One Race for Justice and World Peace, brought to you by Rick Crammond and the members of the Universal Council, is we have been trying to get that passenger ticket, that travel ticket, that allows us to engage with the rest of the universe, that allows us to even travel within our own universe. Because frankly, there are factors at play which have prevented us from doing that. And now that awareness is coming forward. So how do we do that? And it has to do, obviously, with world peace. So that is the bottom line. I keep alluding to the commandments, and especially the missing commandments of number 11, the thou shalt not lie. One of the things that's been a hot topic, besides the 10 commandments, is the emotional part of greed. And the subject has come up this week in a very dynamic way. And the point of the matter is, if we are greedy, does that automatically mean that we have a right to lie, cheat, steal, and kill? If we tell lies, does that mean it gives us the right to be greedy? Or, are all of these things, totally intimately regulated? Well, if we choose to. But there's no rule that says that is so. So what rule are we really following? So if we look at these total 24 commandments, and as they guide us on how we should run our lives, one has to question who issued these commandments. Why did they issue them to us? Why did we need to have them? And what purpose did they serve? And since we have had them, what are the results? And if you're satisfied with the results, well, then so be it. But I think most of the knowledge seekers are not satisfied with the results. Otherwise, they wouldn't work so diligently week after week for over 11 years in trying to bring this knowledge forward. Why has there been so much opposition? So we keep asking these questions, but we don't get the answers, which means that is the answer. The fact that we're not getting the answer is the answer. You see, because the plasma rule is the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. We have adopted a rule where the higher strength eats the weaker strength. This has created a conflict point. Conflict point is another way of saying binding point. And a binding point in a binding zone is a field that is a manifestation. And because that field is drawing energy, it becomes more dense. And since that field is drawing energy from other fields, so we require at least two other fields but not only two fields, to continue feeding that binding zone. But this feeding is an inertia density manifestation, and that is the plasma rule. The thing about the energy binding, and it is self-serving. The fact of the matter is that no one cares about you more than you. As much as we would like to believe otherwise, the fact of the matter is no one knows more than you what you need, what you wish for, and nobody works as hard as you do to achieve that. But that doesn't mean we're all skillful in achieving those things. All what I'm saying is that the energy binding that we require to exist is our dimension point, and it is self-serving. But many of us have discovered, and too many of us have discovered, that this is done at the expense of others who also require their energy self-serving binding needs. So this immediately creates a point of lack. And when those who lack see the results of this kind of conduct, then all of a sudden this becomes socially acceptable. Say, well, you lied to me and you stole from me and you prospered and you got away with it. Well, it just so seems that there are rules for some and rules for others, and they might as well not apply to me. So it becomes acceptable. It becomes socially acceptable to lie, cheat, steal, and kill. And then it becomes part of our genetic code. And over time, it becomes reinforced. And so this is an important point. So we're seen as fallen angels because that is the whole thing of becoming more dense. We call it angular density, and it's depicted as falling. In the process of falling, we have increased density. And of course, that leads to increased pressure. We call it increased gravity. All it is an increased dependence on Earth space feeding, because this leads to more pressure, and this pressure can explode like popcorn. And so it feeds our internal GANS tensity. But angular momentum is conserved. So we only see one side of the picture in this particular discussion. So when we're talking about flow, one of the ways, if we have two bodies of water and we want to flow the water from one body to another body, is to connect by gravity. So elevate one body over another body so that the water from the higher body flows into the lower body. This becomes the falling gradient. But there's another energy that we can't see flowing. It's called loosh. And so we have another practice of loosh harvesting. This becomes a single-minded intention because it's self-serving. And if more people have this single-minded intention, then it becomes part of the hive-mind intention through reinforcement, and becomes a part of the genetics. And so it becomes emblematic of the GANS intention. So honey is sweet, and especially if it's your honey, I would like that. You don't need it. It's excess for you. This exposes a subject about our memory threshold, because most of us are only remembering the short-term memory, the lifelong memory. We have a historical memory, which we're told. We have an ancestral memory, well, actually, which we're told. And there's a universal memory. But how do we cross over that memory threshold? Where's that tipping point, that will give us that long-term memory? So it's the freedom that we're looking for that connects you to that memory. So we can't just look at the memory of how we have fallen here. Because if we are the fallen angels, where do we fall from? Why did we fall? Did we fall? Maybe if you travel out of town and you go to another place, maybe someone would ask you, oh, well, when did you fall? You never say that. You say, well, when did you arrive? Well, I came into town yesterday. You don't say, well, I fell in yesterday. So this business of fallen angels is kind of introducing a concept that is releasing responsibility. And responsibility is what it's all about, because self-serving needs require emotional and physical vitality. And we are deficient. We are deficient by the continual practice of self-serving greed. And then we become party to it. And as we see others succeed where we fail, we may become jealous. And then we may see that, well, that's kind of the way to go. And what's very interesting is that money has a way of concealing everything. So, it's like the Chicago street thug, that was jailed for drug dealing. And, now he's the ruler of a country. And well, congratulations to you, how you've elevated your status in life. And the thing is, of course, he's still a street thug. And that's the problem. The money masks it over, the power masks it over. So it seems that the misconduct becomes justified. Well, look at me. Look how successful I am. This is the method that I chose. And I have succeeded swimmingly. And you are a failure. So you should adopt my ways. And this becomes a very strong argument. So that creates a momentum. And so we find that that momentum is very, very much stuck in the waves of the transmission energy state. It's the lowest, the carbon 12 energy state. Let's say carbon 12 is because we are organic beings, and organic beings are carbon-based. We find in the transition state, higher energy state, carbon 14, which is an isotope, is of a higher energy state, and it's not exhibiting the powers, the problems of falling, such as density and pressure and heat and frequency. And then there's the transmutation highway, the carbon-16, which allows man's universe to connect to the sister universe and beyond. So have we undiscovered skills? Have we unaccounted for skills? Or have we unacknowledged skills? Because every day we go to sleep and every day we wake up. And so there is a transition from the transmission state to the transmutation highway. And we don't understand it. And who do we blame? Do you blame your parents? If your parents had good intentions, they would have told you. But how can parents tell you something when they themselves don't know? And so we see generation after generation go down without having answered these basic questions. They really are basic questions, because it's one of the questions that if you were to ask, very few people could answer. But what's most important is that you are able to answer it yourself. So if you're not satisfied with that answer, then it requires pursuit. But if you couldn't care less, then carry on. And, shall we say, go with the flow? Yeah. And so we had the cups of life, which taught us the nanocoding process. Excuse me. There may be a few interruptions today based on that. So the cups of life were not the cups of pandemic. They demonstrated our inner space emotional strength. And that emotional strength can translate into physical strength. So this is the thing that we're talking about, the GANS tech. And so we see the various GANSes that we can create, the CO2, the calcium, the zinc, copper, water, amino acid, and we can even create gold. And as of May the 10th of this year, we could create as much as you want. So we were able to create these GANSes in our homes. We were able to do that without very expensive exotic equipment. And so many of us had that firsthand experience, which is so vital to understand that there's a magnetical gravitational relationship. And then once that boundary is set, then we have the soul, and the soul sits within that boundary. So we have the cup of emotion and the cup of physicality, and then we have the cup of soul. Now, collectively, those three come together, and you have the magnetical field and the gravitational field, that being the boundary, and then the soul. So now the question becomes, what's the direction of the flow? And who takes priority, and how does it work? Well, the cup of the universe has even a higher priority, because we have two sides of the brain, what we call the hemispheric brain. And one side is emotional, one side is physical, but not only. And then we have the carbogen side, which is actually not in the brain, but is connected to something else. So we have one copper GANS and one zinc GANS and one carbogen GANS, and they come together and give us three, but that creates a soul. But this brain needs to be able to walk and do things on this planet. So it needs a body. did we ever ask those questions? How is everything connected? Well, mathematicians like to connect things with straight lines, and that's the old Euclidean geometry. And, it's easy to draw one line perpendicular to another, but what do you have when you have a hyperbolic figure or an elliptic figure? How do you get that right angle? Well, you have to hit that specific spot, but it's deficient. Whereas the Riemannian geometry started to incorporate the merging of the straight lines with the curved lines. And when you look at the universe, well, everything's kind of curved. And why is that? Well, because the universe is made from multiple turning points. So when we talk about the plasma science and the field strengths, each of them is by orders of magnitude, which means 10 times. So mega is 10 to the power of 6 and giga is 10 to the power of 9, whereas micro is 10 to the minus 6 and nano is 10 to the minus 9. So that means the difference between all of those is 3 orders of magnitude. So that's 10 times 10 is 10 times 10 is 100. And times 10 is 1,000. That is a huge difference. It's not 3 orders of magnitude, it's 1,000. And it's always balanced. So we have the Maggrav balance. So we remember the Maggrav balance is magnetical gravitational equality. And so what we focus on one side, we have to understand that there's an equal and opposite balance. But when we say equal and opposite, not necessarily directly, because excuse me, there's no one-to-one relationship, definitely. One of the obvious questions would be, if the soul is doing the feeding and it is directing the energy flow, who is going to get fed? So, it could be the stomach or the heart or the liver. And then how do we do the direction of flow when we have so many directions to go? So I think we all agree, even though we like to have lunch at noon, the soul doesn't have a feeding schedule and say, okay, we're going to do the kidney on Monday. The nose, you're going to have to wait till Friday. And, but we got to do the legs on Thursday. So the soul feeding is obviously done simultaneously, universally. Well, how do we keep track of all that? Here we are in the basic GANS tech. So one of the things that we were able to achieve is that we were able to produce gold. And this, as I said, was on May the 10th of 2025. This was done in Beijing. And we proved that, men are not the only gold diggers. We can create GANSs, and then we can manifest through inertia density manifestation, gold itself. But not just gold. We can create any product on the periodic table of elements. So this is a revelation, isn't it? Because we don't have to go mining. We can have whatever we want, and it comes from the universe. So now we have a different perspective of the matter plasma dimension, because conventionally we were always looking at the gravitational physical state because we can touch it and see it, or we were looking at the magnetical plasma state, which we can't touch and can't see, but they are all part of the matter plasma. So our interpretation of the life is based on our feedback. Yes, I exist, therefore I am. Great. And what are you exactly? And what are you connected to? Well, what you can say if you're feedback dominant is that you're connected to this planet and that what you see is what you get. But is that acceptable to you? And are you going to accept that answer? Because once we get into the nano alignments, we found that there was a relationship which we called magnetical and gravitational inertia points. But the thing is that the nanocoating around the copper wire was actually a carbon nanocrystal. Oh, wait a second. How did that copper wire become carbon nanocoated? So something has changed. It doesn't seem to add up, does it? So maybe there are different rules at play. And those rules exemplify the Magravs energy transfer states. In other words, we seem to understand atomic states. Now we understand nanostates. Do we understand the GANS states? And those are just the lowest energy states. Those are all part of the matter states. But the rules are the same, where they're balanced. So we can go from one side of the GANS state to the other side of the GANS state and have offsetting energies. But we can also go from one side of the GANS state to the other side of the atomic state. And those are also offsetting energies. But that's, again, we're just saying that that is a one-to-one relationship. So we can call that like the pico turning point. And that becomes very important for us to discuss, because when we were looking at superconductors, we took the copper wire and nanocoated it. And then we took GANS, which is gas as a nanosolid, and we coated the copper wire. And then we increased the field strength. But an interesting thing happened. Before we got to the GANS, there was this intermediate state we called the pico coating state. And when we finally had the technology to actually see the pico, we found that it wasn't very round, but very spiky. So was the pico coating a GANS, or was the pico coating the seed that ended up being a pico popcorn that created the GANS? Because the energy emission or the energy explosion seems to be that of a popcorn. And so it's gotten from that lowest energy state, the pico level, and ended up being of a very, very high energy state. So in that process, as it became 1,000 times smaller, somehow it became 1,000 times bigger. That would be 1,000,000. And so now we discovered some secrets, how we had this GANS freakout. We had these field forces. One in the core was a positive charge, which was gravitational, and one was on the periphery, which was a negative charge. it was magnetical. So we can see the relationship between the charges. So what this is very important is to understand that the negative is the giver. Once you understand that, and that becomes your roadmap, that becomes your marker. Once you identify what is the negative charge, then from there things follow. But let's face it, what's the direction of flow? Where are you going? And that isn't necessarily identified. So last week we talked about polyatomic. And so when we looked at a molecular connection, we found that there must have been a communication link. We could say it's a covalent bond between two masses. So these are just nondescript masses. But what we're saying with the plasma science is that one is magnetical and one is gravitational. And so the negative is giving to the gravitational. Since the gravitational is more dense, then the magnetical is falling towards the gravitational. However, there has to be an offsetting energy flow. So now that the gravitational has received that energy, it has more energy to give. And the giving of that energy is magnetical. And where does it go? Well, it goes to another gravitational destination. We cannot assume that it goes back to the origin, because if it was, then it would be like a dog chasing its tail, and will round and round and round and basically go nowhere. So it's not true. It does go round and round, but it does exist because of mag-grav relationship, the magnetical gravitational relationship. So there, now we start to understand more about the polyatomic connection points, and how, as we understand this, we will become more unchained. I mean, look at the caterpillar. It's linked up with various parts of the body, and each part of the body has a couple of legs, and kind of very interesting. But it's in the shape of a chain, but it's a very flexible chain. And it's flexible, which means it can expand and contract at its joints. Well, we do the same thing with our spine, don't we? So we shouldn't be too astounded with the caterpillar, because we have our own little caterpillar in our backbone. So these polyatomic chains represent various ways and means that we can have a connection. So whether it's from one field strength to another field strength, that becomes a bonding point. Or we have one field strength to a different field strength, that also requires a bonding point. Or we can have a different field strength or a totally different element, and that also becomes a different bonding point. So these are just three examples of polyatomic chains. Well, hydrogen, on the other hand, is diatomic. And the way it is defined is based on its polarity. So if we have the similar poles, which obviously repel, then since the poles are repelling at both sides, then the covalent bond is in balance. But if we were to flip the poles, so opposite poles would attract, well, they would attract on both sides. And so the covalent bond would still be balanced. However, there is a difference between the orthohydrogen and the parahydrogen. So this kind of difference is also reflected in the polyatomic GANSs. So when we look at the GANSs, we have carbon dioxide, which when you look at the components, copper, zinc, water, and salt, none of it is carbon. However, when you look at the zinc oxide, there is zinc involved, except that one of those zincs is nano-coated zinc, which means it has copper. I'm sorry, it means it has carbon. Excuse me. So the zinc and the nano-coated zinc also involves carbon, and we produce a zinc oxide. Now, interestingly enough, the copper oxide is a copper, a nano-coated copper, which is carbon, and that produces a carbon oxide. So we start to see a pattern here. And the common denominator, of course, is the carbon. And this goes back to the highway, the transmutation highway, because what we're seeing here is the manifestation of the inertia density manifestation on the transmission level, the lowest energy state. And what we are doing is enlisting the services of higher energy state. So when we look at the GANSs, they start to react differently. So if we understand then that nothing is nothing, something is something, and something is always something as opposed to being something else. So the environment that it's in and the fields that are feeding that environment affect what's going on. But the interesting thing is when we look at the GANSs, they start to create a rotating field. And there's a direction of flow. And it increases by being constantly worked, by being constantly reinforced. And that rotation increases to the point where there's a hole in the GANS. And so the question is, what's in the hole? Is there a soul in the hole? So if we have a magnetical gravitational boundary, then we have a soul to complete the maggraph. So what we're creating is based on the susceptibility. It depends on the conditions. So we can change the conditions and determine what is what. And as such, we can also control the direction of flow. So the control is based on charge. So when we look at the types of energy movement, there's that rotating field we talk about. But then there's also a polar energy. So the polar energy goes vertically, but the rotating field goes horizontally. And depending on the speed of rotation and the strength of the rotation and the direction of the rotation, we can identify the magnetical or gravitational force fields that are involved. Understanding, of course, that the emission fields are magnetical and the absorption fields are gravitational. Understanding that the magnetical is the giver, so that's part of the emission. Understanding the gravitational is the taker, so that's part of the absorption. So far, we're doing just fine. And we extend our knowledge to understand that the Earth has created elements. And each of these elements is manifest from a GANS. So if we understand that's a two-way street, then we can say, well, the GANSs can be created from the elements the same way that we created the copper and the zinc GANS. But then the GANSs can be created from the universe and manifest into the elements. And that is the same way the Earth does it. So we have now started to play with the power of the Earth. And so these energy fields are representative in like the star core components, which we see there's a relationship between what we call the magnetical and the gravitational. So the gravitational being the base and the magnetical being the top point. And the difference in energy strength is the gradient charge. But a charge has to go somewhere. And so a neighbor might also have a magnetical gravitational relationship, but it will either be stronger or weaker. And so depending on which, one will be with a magnetical gravitational charge and the other one will be with a gravitational gradient charge. So that'll give us a direction of flow. So if the magnetical is giving to the gravitational, and so we have the 2 points of view, whereas one is giving and one is taking, well, they would have to be in opposite phase. Well, how do we bring these two together? Because like poles will repel. So when we look at the GANS inertia point, it didn't go at the poles, it went within the star formation. And that became part of the GANS containment and it became more gravitational. So that created a gravitational gradient charge. So when we get these binding points coming together, we see these gravitational falling binding points. And that's just an arbitrary point of view. What we're ignoring are the loose ends because they appear like they're just terminal ends, that they come from nowhere. But that's just because you don't know where it comes from doesn't mean it's not coming from somewhere. So we're just discussing in generic terms that point of view. So when we look at the star core inertia points, there's a turning point. This becomes a manifestation point of view. That becomes a gravitational inertia point. So one is a magnetical feeder, and the other is a magnetical feeder. Okay, so we have two trains coming together on one track. Isn't that great? So then we have different inertia gradients. So each one is susceptible to increase or decrease. But remember, if one is susceptible to increase, then the other one is susceptible to decrease. And so this changes the gravitational inertia point. And so they rotate around this point. So when we introduce the concept of the duality, we find that each of these points has to work in its self-contained basis. But a duality involves a tandem, a partnership. We call it a twinity. So where one field works with another field. Well, this is good because when you have that energy, you have to engage with something else because otherwise you'd be like a dog chasing its tail and you'd be getting nowhere fast. So this is how ray motion is created. So we have the creation of energy on the one side, which is a balance between the natural creation and natural decay. And we have the energy on the other side, which is the balance between the natural decay and natural creation. But there's also a boundary there, a bonding fudge factor. And I say fudge factor because we don't really know what it is. It just, these things stick together. So isn't that wonderful? But when we get into the plasma science and the advanced plasma science, these answers have to come forward because otherwise you could be making a big mistake. So if we understand the basics of the concept of the twinity, so the nanotech has a relationship with 2 points. The picotech has that same relationship. Well, stars also have the 2 points of the star tech. So we have the discussion with the twinity of the nanotech and the twinity of the GANS tech. That's where we are today. However, when we look at the relationship with other polyatomic structures, we see that it's a web of a relationship between the magnetical gravitational force fields, and they rotate around multiple turning points. So all of them have the magnetical giving, and all of them have the gravitational taking. And that's how we are able to exchange energy and maintain that bonding point. So we have the two ways to transmit energy. One is through the horizontal transmission, which is the rotation, and one is the vertical transition, which is through the poles. And so the point within is the Earth space point within the Earth space field. And so this field goes all the way around the Earth space, and we are in that field. And so we're able to move around this planet. Although the planet is rotating, we are walking effortlessly around this planet, and we're able to change position. In the process of changing that position, we are giving and taking energy. In the rotating of the field of the Earth space, it is also giving and taking of energy. So the question then becomes, is the direction of flow? If the Earth space is rotating, how does it know which way it's going? And if we're walking and changing our position, how do we know which way we're going? And then how does the Earth space and its relationship know where we're walking? So in other words, we have the three relationships: the Earth space with its Earth point, man space with its man point, and the relationship between those 2 points. It seems like a silly question, except that we haven't been able to explain the motion, because what we see with the motion, it becomes a polyatomic gradient transitioning, and it's constantly transitioning between the feeding radiance and the feedback radiance. So this energy is forever flowing. So the field in the center is the gravitational plasma. The field on the exterior is the magnetical plasma. But the magnetical plasma is magnetical, so therefore it goes to the gravitational, except there's another magnetical plasma there. Well, that's strange. How can magnetical plasma be giving to another magnetical plasma? In its relationship between those 2 points, the one magnetical plasma is actually gravitational. And so when you're looking at that motion, it's the magnetical to the gravitational. Now, the magnetical plasma will continue that and give again, and creating that domino effect. And it'll continue to reinforce. So this field strength will continue to get increased because the feeding radiance has to continue and the feedback radiance has to keep coming. And it is not an island. It is not just a dog chasing his tail, but it has to be somewhere, and it has to engage with some other things in order for it to exist. So we're just looking at a picture, and that's the whole thing. When we're looking at all the different levels of energy, we have to understand that there's always something in behind. What we're looking at on the physical side, while we talk about the transmission, transition, and transmutation highway, we have to understand, well, there's something on the other side. And it too is balanced in the same way. So to balance these fields off means that we have to take more into account than what we have been used to. So when we're talking about moving energy, if we remember what we were talking about, the pumping effect. So the pumping is to say get water from one vessel to another vessel. So in order to do that, you want to create a water bridge. So one of the ways to do that is with a siphon, and another is with an actual pump. Or you could use the pump to pump it through the siphon and then turn the pump off and the siphon will continue to go. And the reason for that is because you've set up a gradient. So once you turn the pump off, what creates this flow? Well, it's what we call the capillary effect. So what does that mean? That means the water flowing from one side is operating as a magnetical field, and the water on the other side is operating as a gravitational side. What is the net result? Well, the result would be that the first field will become depleted, and the second field will become full. So how long can this last? Well, it all depends on how big your reservoir is. So in order to keep it going, we introduce a daisy chain where you connect all the different vessels together. And so now you have a direction of flow where you pump the water in on one place and let it fall out on the other side. And you can change the strength of the flow. So we have now determined the direction of flow. So we have an in and we have an out. And everything in between is a connection. And then we can change this. We can put a lot of pressure on the first field coming in. And so is there a delay so that this pressure will become less and less and less as we go from field to field to field? Or will it become stronger because of the accumulation, the reinforcement of the intensity? So both of these are possible. However, if we remember from our musical chairs that we have a pressure field and we come from the outside, and if we want to get to that core, we have to continue and work harder, because as we get to the core, we get pressure from the outside. So getting back to the vessels, now we're introducing a charge effect where the negative gives and the positive takes. So the flow isn't just from the one vessel to the other, but there also is a negative emission and a positive absorption. So if we understand the charge effect and how it works differently from the pressure effect, then going back to our daisy chain, we can see that there's an interaction of two different types of energy exchange. One is a pressure flow from vessel to vessel, and one is a charge flow from the poles of one vessel to the pole of the other vessel. And so it will continue in its daisy chain manner. Okay, so far that's, I guess, easy to understand. But the thing is, with the pressure fields, the pressure comes from the out, because what is arriving is the magnetical pressure. And what is absorbing is the gravitational absorption. So in that point, the gravitational field effect is getting stronger. It is getting more dense. And as we proceed towards that gravitational core, we tend to fall. Or it appears that we are falling. We're falling towards the density, falling towards the gravity. Except, in reality, the daisy chain isn't just one to the other, but it's what we call a contiguous daisy chain. In other words, we still have the direction of flow and we can still change the strength of the flow, but we looked at the flow from one to the other. And then we looked at the polarity from one to the other. But in the plasma, it is not restricted in that flow from one to the other. In other words, the higher strength will feed the lower strength, and it'll feed it unconditionally. So the higher field strength on the left will feed the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth vessel. So there'll be a contiguous flow of energy. And it'll all still flow in that one direction because of the pattern that we've set up. But that is a pattern that only has a direction of flow in one direction. So when we look at connections that affect us, we see that there's a biological, physical connection. That's part of the feeding. There's also a legal, physical connection. That's part of the feedback. So we're looking at man-made laws versus universal laws. So the biological, emotional connection is the feeding. The emotional positioning is the feedback. So when we look at the maternal egg, that's part of the feeding. But the paternal sperm is the feedback. These are the family connections that we have grown accustomed to. And so here we are in the eye of the hurricane, where words don't matter, hierarchies don't matter. We have this false detachment because, we can't relate. And we see this holographic universe, which is fake. So as we increase our awareness of our point of view and start to incorporate our ancestral point of view, then when we are in the eye of the hurricane, depending on which way we go, we can change the direction of flow. We don't have to just sit there and let the hurricane pass us by. We can do something about it because the rate of transmission is the feeding of the soul intention, which is specific to the soul. That's the emotion of presence. And the feedback, which is environment specific, is the presence of physicality. And these two converge in the magnetical gravitational balance under the peace dome. the peace dome is the field that allows this action to happen. So when we look at the cup relationships, we understand that, yes, there's the cup of emotion and the cup of physicality and the cup of the soul, but there's also the cup of the earth and the inertia field therefrom. So each of them have a magnetical gravitational relationship, and each of them radiate the soul. And they all work together. And so do we. We have our physicality, which is part of the earth, and we have the soul of physicality, which is part of that radiance. And we see that radiance because that is part of that vertical alignment that we saw in the $603 Seekers Workshop. But there's a connection, and it follows a path, and it always has a direction. But as you can see, it's like a noodle. It can go everywhere, like spaghetti. So what regulates the direction of flow? So this vertical alignment is based on the infinity loop, where we have the magnetical field on the one side representing the soul, and we have the gravitational field on the other side representing the physicality. And then we have the crossover in the center, which is the path that is governed by the soul of physicality. So now we have a better understanding of what's going on in this map. But the question is, how do we change that path? So there's another path. There's an inertia field emission. And this allows us to cross that inertia threshold. And it doesn't follow that path, the original vertical alignment. And so that also has to be taken into account. So we understand that this becomes the susceptibility gradient. There's a chain link and there's a path link. So the chain link is a physical atomic structure, and the humanity is the polyatomic path link. And the soul of physicality is monatomic. The soul is diatomic. So we're looking at the polyatomic gradient transitioning between the soul of physicality, and the physicality. And it's encapsulated in this chain, which only breaks open when we go to sleep at night, which allows the soul to meander. And how it does that is by understanding the negative positive junction, the negative transition between the X, Y, and Z axis, and the positive transition between its X, Y, and Z axis. And when you bring those two fields together, one is negative, one is positive, you have this transfer state negative positive junction. And so that acts as one field. And that affects the direction of flow. So our attention reflects our direction of flow. So we have to have a unity within the community. That's one field. We also have to have an inner space unity. That's another field. So there has to be some kind of bonding between the one moment. There has to be a bonding between the mental and physical, also bonding between the soul and the consciousness, and also between energy and intention. It does not specify the direction of flow. It just means that we're encapsulated within this field. And so the energy is going round and round. So in summary, the progression of energy is from that nanopoint, which is going towards that density. We call that falling. And then come to that pico point, which is highly gravitational. And then we go to that GANS point, which is towards the gaseousness. And that leads us to that plasma point, which is highly magnetical. So the difference between what we call power drawing is the gravitational intensity, and the power providing is the magnetical outintensity. So that's what we have to remember. The magnetical is the giver. So it's providing the power. That's the secret. So in the conservation of energy, the one side has to equal the other side. That's the law of conservation of energy. The balance between the magnetical gravitational force fields of each and every component, and then balancing them off with other aspects. And it's all unspecified, but frankly, it's also unconditional. So when we're talking about energy portability, fundamentally, it's energy state transition. When we say elevation, that's going from the physical matter state to the energy state. When we say inertia, that's going from the energy state to the physical matter state. So elevation involves expansion, and that's what the GANS popcorn is an expansion of the field strength in like popcorn, and it's giving off many points of emission. So with those many points of emission, we can now understand why the Earth space range details involve so many elements. And they're all unique, and each one is specific. So the direction of flow must be somehow regulated. It isn't just all a soup. We have individual elements that can be identified. So to understand the nuclear feeding inertia, we have to understand that even the fragments operate by the same rules as the complexity. There's a gravitational stability, but there's a dimensional portability. And so this goes from point to point. And so when we have the three fields of the physical points, we also have the three fields of the nuclear points. And there's more. This is just an intro. So these maggrav pathways follow the basic rules of gravitational intensity, which is the attraction field forces called feedback, and the magnetical outintensity forces, which we call repulsion. That's the feeding. So that's the difference between the electron and a neutron. And I'm sure you can see the difference. So when we looked at the undifferentiated beginning, say, okay, well, the neutron came before the atom. And so when we looked at that and we checked the mass, we found that the neutron had a certain mass, but the atom had a combination marriage with the electron and the proton, but the mass did not equal. So something was missing. And so that was the PM tick. And how could the PM tick exist if it wasn't in some kind of magnetical gravitational balance? Then when we take the mass of the PM tick and the mass of the atom, that equaled that of the neutron. So this is where, when we talk about coming from darkness, that's within. And we say, let there be light, that's coming without. Why? Because this is not a contained exercise. It's not a dog just chasing its tail. This has to interact with the rest of the universe. You cannot extract yourself from the universe. Everything includes everything. So the principal matter of the PM ticks are magnetical, and they converge with the antimatter, dark matter, and the matter gen, and create this maggrav condition, highly gravitational, which we call Earth. That's the field interaction that's created by inertia. So now we've got a clear picture where the plasma of one and the plasma of another come together, but one will be stronger than the other. And strength is not the only criteria. Direction of flow and the characteristics all come into play because it all depends on how it works with the covalent bonding. The fundamental point is that these dimension points have to have a magnetical gravitational relationship. And then when they bound together, they have a GANS. That is the fundamental inertia point, the fundamental dimension point. And then from there, well, you just have to decide which direction you want to go. So if we're talking about gravitational conformation, we find that the hydrogen, once it comes in contact, although it's a gas and it's non-visible, it emits a spectrum of color. So we know that it is hydrogen because that is its fingerprint. And we know that the emission always shows you that fingerprint because with the night vision, we can still see those that are animate because it always shows the emission. The aura shows a specific color. The physicality shows no color. So this is the difference between the animate and the inanimate. And so the gravitational conformation means that there's an emission light and it's crossing that threshold. So like hydrogen, the oxygen is also a non-visible gas, but once it creates that light, it gives you an emission fingerprint, the emission spectrum. So here we go. And that becomes the basis of how seeds are created. So we look at the dimension seeds and they look like a GANS popcorn. And what they are is field strengths coming together from various things that create that construct. Non-specific, just what it needs. And each one is different. So this is why when you look at a pumpkin seed, you could never imagine it would come up with it like a pumpkin. So it's shocking, isn't it? The transformation that it goes through. So these star formations have dimension points of view. So this Magritte singularity, which is the soul point of view, and the soul of physicality point of view, that hits the threshold of awareness. Once you cross that and get your physical interpretation and share that with others, that becomes the collective point of awareness. So now we have the range from that magnetical star formation to that gravitational density manifestation coming together of various fields. So when we looked at the Peace Dome reactor, we see that there was shielding. That's a dimension point. There's star positioning. That's a different dimension point. And then there's possession. That's a different dimension point. So the gold was the possession. So when we look at the daisy chain disruption, we now have to ask ourselves, what would happen to the flow if we were to interrupt this siphon effect in the middle? Well, clearly the flow would stop. However, there will be an overflow at the third. So that flow will no longer be magnetical at the third position. It would be highly gravitational. So the direction of flow would be rerouted. What would happen if we interrupted the polar flow? Would that still stop? Because the actual physical flow of the water is not part of the polar flow. The physical flow of the water is restricted to the siphon effect. So the direction of flow and the strength of the flow would remain the same. The actual flow of the water would stop. So if each field emits its own polar energy, has its own polar emission, that would change. That would change the strength of the flow. So then the question comes, what would happen if we were to disrupt the contiguous flow? By the very definition of contiguous, that is a connection, but not necessarily next to each other. So therefore, the flow from vessel to vessel could stop, but the contiguous connection would remain, because the contiguous connection is not dependent on the nearness and proximity of the vessel, but by the field strength. So to understand, to create, we have to understand to disrupt. So we're all experts at disrupting. And that disruption is most important on the communication side, because what you know can't hurt you. And maybe what you do know can also hurt you. Maybe a little bit of knowledge is dangerous. It doesn't specify what kind of knowledge. But when we look at the communication on a cellular basis, we have the cells in the body are all communicating with each other all over the place. So if we have a cancer that starts out as a seed, so the cancer is a disruption of this communication, but the communication still continues. There is a stability in that communication. It's an intercellular gravitational stability. Your body is stable. Just the cancer is a disruption of that stability. So if we look at the gravitational field effects, what we call the materialization effects, the heart materialization precedes the brain. And then there's the blood materialization. And this goes throughout the body, but around the brain. And so that affects the communication. But the blood does not come in contact with every cell. But the immune system does. So the immune system is somehow connecting from the brain to the heart. The brain, which is connected to the universal cup, and the heart that is connected to the soul cup of physicality. So this disruption, it either is going to increase or decrease, and is either going to be reinforced or is going to be eliminated. So in order to understand this better, we have to see how it relates to the magnetosphere. So we have the magnetical peace dome, and the soul of the earth body is in the biosphere range. So the non-differentiated gravitational magma is in the core, and the soul of the earth is in the core. So we see the structure of the rotating field. But that vanishing point is at the core because everything is falling into that dense core. And it's all converging into that dense core. And then where does it go? So we see the gravitational stability of the earth and the gravitational stability of our physicality, because both of us operate the same way with the communication, the unconditional feeding. All the elements on the earth have to be fed at the same time. All the elements in the body have to be fed at the same time. We can't discriminate the liver from the kidney. And we can't say, well, Thursday, we're going to work on the legs, and maybe if we have enough time, we'll get around to the face. I don't know. But when we're looking at the reality dimension, we find that outer space is not a place. It's a method of energy transfer. And so this energy is always in motion, and that's the whole purpose of what we're talking about. So when we're looking at that dreamscape point of view, what is our dream? Our dream is to have this peace dome, which is working with the soul of the cell soul, and is connecting to the universal community. Because we always ask, well, when we're talking about energy, the give and take is from where? And then who does the leader follow? And what is the source of your inspiration? These are important questions. These aren't things that you need to think about. These are things that if you're asked, you need to answer off right away. Because the thing about it, we have a connection between the inner space and the outer space, and we have to know this connection through just knowing. And that's the difference between the feeding and the feedback. So what we're saying is the direction of flow is universal, and it's based on a contiguous connection, and it's determined by the relationship of the magnetical gravitational force fields. So when we're trying to connect the dots, we're trying to find there's a practical point, a practical reasoning. So to determine that road to self-determination, or that road from self-determination, we're looking for a practical philosophy and a practical solutions. So the practical currency of life is the currency of the creator. That's the future. That's what we're talking about. So when we're looking at these Magrav relationships, there's always this awareness between the earth space and the inner space. A Magrav relationship between man's universe and the sister universe. Likewise, there's a Magrav relationship between the universe and the unicos. So all follow the same plasma rules, and all of them exert a shielding in order to exist properly, they have to shield it from hostiles, from aggression, from environmental harm, from fear-mongering, from emotional abuse. And so here we are at the point where we have this artificial awareness. We have to look at this generational point of view. Artificial intelligence gives us a rapid generational learning, a rapid historic generational learning. However, we have to cross that threshold of transgenerational awareness and patch into the teachings of the Creator, also known as the truth. So we have been depending on supplementation for a long time, and it's been reinforced constantly because it's due to consumption. It's an acquired knowledge. It was a conditional teaching by ancient teachers. This is opposed to the unconditional teaching by the Creator. So the new awareness is the historical threshold between the cosmic feeding and the loosh harvesting. And that's what this is all about. So when man has to demonstrate its cross as a burden, that is the difference between the soul and the physicality, and the threshold of the soul of physicality and the connection. So those are the only two dimensions you want to take into account. You're missing the biggest picture of all, and that is the awareness integration, where you have this manifestation by the Creator and you have this manifestation by humanity. And it's all put together in the image of the Creator. However, we have become consumers. We have become greedy in our self-serving needs. There has been an artificial inequality created in that process. So we're headed into uncharted territory. So we're with the herd at that turning point to understand that there are many stars beyond the nano-monatomic state. They cover the full range from the decay to the radiation. And we are actually the ancestral intelligence. We are the technology. We are the inertia product. We are the image of our dimensional convergence point. So this soul food is required. We need to tune in, plug into the Creator, turn on to the energy, and drop out of our resistance so that we can receive that inertia point. This is the pattern, and this is how we get the energy. We have now the ability to choose. For 608 weeks in a row, the Knowledge Seekers workshops have been brought together to create that greater oneness. It seems like we're suddenly transcending the limitations of nuclear science, but it's been generations in the making. And so here we are trying to convert diamonds to gold. And we've succeeded. And there are many other things that we can create as a result, because we're in the post-May the 10th, 2025 era. So calling out to all the advanced research teams, this is the future. It's time to get with the program, because we're on the verge of a massive technology release. It's hard to sleep when our beds are burning. So we're looking for a scientific, financial, political preservation rescue, a consumption rescue, a creation rescue. And we are the rescuers. So we're continually providing the transmutation tests. And the next one is coming up in September. And there will be more to follow. Are we part of the fallen dimensions? Because we're none of the other dimensions, because we're the observers. We are observing the creation of matter. We are observing the structure of light, and we're observing the origin of the universe. And what is their point of view? Well, today is World Peace Day. I hope we all remember when we signed our commitment to world peace to make a peaceful place for ourselves through our own conducts. Get it in before you get it out. Our mission is to bring peace on earth and join humanity with the universal community. We want to bring man as equal to all the beings in the universe by teaching the plasma science and technology equally to everyone, that no one is left out and no one is abused due to lack of knowledge. It's time to help us achieve this goal. This is Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science, welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers, all part of this carbon nation that is learning about the new selection process of the new organic plasma science. There's a World Peace Treaty. Choose it. Sign it unconditionally, just like the soul feeding, and mean it sincerely. The point of the true tech is to cross polyatomic boundaries. Let me try again. The point of the true GANS tech is to cross polyatomic boundaries. The peace dome of outer space can be your guiding beacon. Is the inertia of the present governed by dimensions of history? Did you ever ask that question? Is it time to learn the history of self in a universal context? That's another question. Did you ask yourself? And the GANS, which is within you, is a peaceful superconductor of true intentions. So be mindful of those intentions, because energy flows may be explosions or maybe the spark that ignites life as we know it. It all depends on the direction of flow, doesn't it? Plasma science needs to continue to be delivered daily via the Peace Dome in a practical exchange for peace on Earth. So, welcome to the new golden outer space age. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the trip.
Well, thank you, Alex, for coming in, and we give you energies to balance out whatever energy pack you're dealing with. I'm sure you could have just said you didn't feel like it today, but thank you so much for coming in. And again, this was just a basic aspect of what you shared here. There's so much, it's still not quite clear to me, but maybe some of the participants would like to ask a question. So yes, we do give you the energy you need, Alex. And maybe, as Mr. Keshe indicated in the past, maybe you're getting immunized to handle that, being that space traveler, just another little energy pack that you won't have to worry about when you get in that energy dimension, perhaps. So thank you for coming in. Anyone have any questions? Let's see if anyone would like to raise a point. I know Randy had put something in the chat earlier, and he said after the 608 ended, I had so much energy that I worked on a project until 6:30. I noticed that my creative process was very sharp and still is today. Went to bed and woke up at 10:30 and woke up fully rested. It feels like my awareness of my surroundings are much sharper. I had a similar experience last Thursday. Near the end of the workshop, I felt kind of tired, almost wanted to lay down, but I was at the kitchen table. I decided not to. But then I had something to do on Thursday at 1:30, but about 10:30 in the morning, I decided to do a project, and I was hoping I would finish it before that 1:30 time, and I sure did. So I would say I had more energy as well that particular day. Anyone else have any experiences from, he said they're feeding you so much energy, probably more than you even need. But whether it's energy for energy as we understand it in the physicality, or energies that brings enlightenment, as he said, each one of those dots is a dimension of enlightenment. So a beautiful process we're going to, totally unknowns to us, and how these changes will be part of the whole planet. But I just wanted to, let's see, this picture, and it came in my mind. I'm just going to share the screen for a moment, Alex, and then you can take it back. Let's just see here. And when Mr. Kesh had originally shown these sort of gas reactors, spinning reactors, and then we see these tubes, and these tubes where they were introducing other energies, in other gases into this system, different ones at different times and different strengths and different amounts. But it's almost as if he was telling us in the future, this is the, let's say, this is the earth and this is the sun, and how he's touching them. And now we see that this whole, in a way, setup and what's going on is to bring these new energies, almost like introducing new gases to this planet, but it'll actually be cosmic rays. So I just thought I'd share that for a minute. And I didn't never made a gas reactor or worked with this, but it just dawned on me recently that perhaps this is what all these teachings were leading to, of elevation of the planet and all its inhabitants, just showing you energy transfer in a way in this sort of gas reactor dimension. So it was just something. You can take the screen back again, Alex.
Actually, Mark, I have a situation I've got to take care of.
Okay.
Could you excuse me from the rest of the meeting then, please?
Yes, no problem. For
I
being,
want to thank
we appreciate you sharing your energies with us. And
I
we,
want to thank everyone for allowing me to continue to present, and also want to reinforce the fact that this is not a game. This is what life is about, and games are fun, and life should also be fun. So when we see so much misery around the world, we have to ask ourselves, well, what kind of game are you playing? And why are you playing that? What is the intention? So I think we will all need to dig deep and discover our true intentions.
just one question, Alex. You showed the 24 commandments. What commandment is the greed connected with in a way, or is it all of them, or just, I was thinking, thou shalt not steal, which I believe was the eighth one you showed.
Well, the one reason I pick on thou shalt not lie is because once you lie, then you have to cover up the lie. So you have to make another lie to cover up the first lie, otherwise you'll be found out. And the thing about it is that if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. So if you're sweeping up the rug, the dirt underneath the carpet, you say, okay, well, I cleaned everything, but don't look under the carpet. And so the thing is that you lied. So the lie itself is actually to yourself. And once you find that acceptable, then you can graduate to the next level, the lying, the cheating, the stealing, and then the killing. And then you find that the reason you're doing this is because of the greed. But the greed in itself is not a license to lie, cheat, steal, and kill. It's a prime motivator, but it doesn't give you license to do that. You arbitrarily take that license. And we have reinforced that genetically through many, many generations. And so it becomes acceptable. And, what are you supposed to think? You're a major, uh, Chicago street thug, and then you end up being a political dynamo. You know, you've changed your clothes, but you know, you're still a street thug and you operate like a street thug. So you find that the true intention has never disappeared, but clearly the rewards are there. So you would be a shining example. Oh, you want to be a success like me? This is what you have to do. But you never admit that this is where you came from. So you always kind of hide that and you preserve that. And so that feeds your greed because you were greedy to achieve that success, but that success is a false success, right? Because you didn't do it the universal way, you did it the man-made way, the way man has taught himself to be greedy, to steal, to lie, to cheat, to kill, because we crave for somebody else's possession. So that includes, you know, uh, someone else's spouse, for instance, and it goes both ways. So this is a conduct that in many ways has become socially acceptable, and it's gotten much worse thanks to the communication that we are being presented. And it seems like our whole society has degenerated into a bunch of immoral hooligans. I don't believe that for a minute. I think it's just that we have been forced to take that for so long. And, you know, it's kind of the food we've been forced to eat. That is not necessarily, how should we say it? One does not necessarily follow the other. If it's we choose it to be that way, that's what I'm saying. So if we choose it, then we can choose it to be the other way as well. So the conduct begins at home. And as today is Peace Day, you know, I'm just going to take the screen back for a second. Do you mind?
No, no, go ahead.
Because that is what one of the things that I did want to I did want to mention because it's obviously very important because not only is it important today, I didn't know that this World Peace Day was acknowledged in 1981. I mean, what do I know? I'm just, you know.
I've never seen it posted on a calendar anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. However, we first have to make a peaceful place for ourselves through our own conduct. So, you know, it's hard for a drug dealer to complain about being mugged on the way home when the guy who does the mugging is seeking the money that he has to pay for the drugs that the drug dealer is selling. So, you know, you basically make your own bed and you end up sleeping in it. So if you want a peaceful society, you have to live in a peaceful society. But you know, you can't be a crook in one part and then expect to go into another part and end up being the model citizen. Well, you can fool the people there, but you know, you really can't fool yourself. And this is where the hurtfulness manifests itself. So at some point in time, that vulnerability becomes exposed. And the way to do that is by changing the field strength. And that's what we're on to. We are changing the field strength of this planet under the Peace Dome and extending this Peace Dome beyond just this planet because this is the first thing. We have to make a peaceful place for ourselves, and Earth is our home. We didn't fall here, we arrived here. Thanks very much, everybody. I hope I answered your question there. And please carry on, Mark.
Okay. I don't know how much longer we'll go, but thank you, Alex, and have a great rest of your day.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
And hopefully we see you next week. I thought maybe since we all have a ego or an id or a super ego, maybe we'll just close. This is a very short question, just a couple of minutes. Maybe we'll examine a little bit more about this ego. And I believe we all have one, but perhaps we can minimize it in a way, even though, as he says here, some egos are for the benefit of man. Anyone want to raise a question or make a point or like to share anything? All right, I think it starts around here. Why don't we just listen to this last question about the ego? Again, all these teachings are about you, not so much the others, even though we're learning to serve the others in part of this process. But we're finding out more about ourselves and the mystery of the energies within ourselves. And of course, not everything we need is provided on this planet. This is why the Keshe Foundation is introducing certain fields and certain energies which the universe was supposed to provide for this planet, as I understand it. So this is part of the corrective process by introducing the new energies or energies that weren't here before. We change the timeline and bring man into a peaceful position, as well as all the other entities on this planet, from the ant to the lion. So if there's no other questions, we'll play a couple-minute question for you to, again, think about, and then we'll play the final disclaimer, and the meeting will come to an end. Thank you all again for carrying a very large part, or very small part of a very large carpet, this carpet of peace.